In the summer of 1463, a flat-bottomed barge drifted through the Venetian lagoon toward the customs house at Punta della Dogana. Its cargo was stacked in rough wooden barrels, sealed with wax, and marked with the winged lion of St. Mark. Inside each barrel lay coarse white crystals harvested from shallow Adriatic pans. Clerks in dark robes stood at long tables, dipping quills into ink and recording the shipment in thick ledgers. A duty was assessed. A seal was stamped. Armed guards watched from the quay. The cargo was not silk from Damascus or silver from the Tyrol. It was salt. In that moment, Venice was not merely receiving a commodity. It was receiving revenue, leverage, and control. The crystals in those barrels would preserve meat in alpine villages, cure fish along the Dalmatian coast, and season bread across northern Italy. They would also finance galleys, fortifications, and diplomacy. In certain regions and at certain times, salt commanded a price that rivaled, and occasionally exceeded, that of gold. The reason lay not in rarity alone, but in necessity. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was growing. Cities expanded. Armies mobilized more frequently. Long-distance trade intensified. All of it depended on preservation. Before refrigeration, salt was the essential technology that allowed food to travel and to endure. Cod caught in the North Atlantic could reach Iberian ports only if packed in salt. Pork slaughtered in autumn could sustain a household through winter only if cured. Without it, supply chains shrank to the limits of immediate consumption. This created a structural constraint. Demand for salt was constant and inelastic. A family might forego silk in a lean year. It could not forego preservation. States recognized this. Where demand is unavoidable and supply can be controlled, revenue follows. Salt production, however, was geographically limited. It required coastal flats with the right climate for evaporation or inland brine springs and forests to fuel boiling houses. Transporting it was heavy work. Overland routes demanded animals, wagons, and security. River and sea routes required ships and protected harbors. Control the choke points, and one controlled the trade. Venice understood this early. From the 12th century onward, the Republic invested not only in ships and arsenals, but in saltworks. It purchased, seized, or negotiated access to evaporation pans along the Adriatic. It restricted competing production in territories under its influence. In some cases, it ordered the destruction of rival saltworks to concentrate output in Venetian-controlled facilities. The mechanism was methodical. Salt harvested in state-supervised pans was transported to Venice. There, officials set prices and imposed duties before resale. Merchants could distribute it inland, but only after paying fees. In territories under Venetian rule, local populations were often required to purchase a fixed quota from state sources, regardless of cheaper alternatives. Revenue flowed predictably. Unlike war booty or sporadic tribute, salt provided steady income. It was consumed daily by rich and poor alike. A tax on salt was not a one-time levy. It was a continuous stream. France developed its own version. By the 14th century, the French crown had established the gabelle, a salt tax that varied by region but often required households to buy a minimum quantity from royal warehouses at fixed prices. Enforcement was strict. Smuggling, the clandestine transport of untaxed salt, became a widespread occupation and a crime heavily prosecuted. In both Venice and France, the pattern was similar. The state identified a commodity that people could not avoid. It consolidated production or distribution. It inserted itself between producer and consumer. It turned necessity into fiscal infrastructure. Gold, by contrast, functioned differently. It stored wealth and facilitated large transactions. It was prized, portable, and durable. But daily survival did not depend on gold. A peasant household might never see a gold coin. It would handle salt every week. In parts of West Africa, this distinction became visible in market ratios. During the height of the trans-Saharan trade between the 8th and 16th centuries, caravans carried slabs of Saharan salt southward across the desert. In cities such as Timbuktu and Gao, salt could exchange weight for weight with gold in certain periods. Gold was abundant in the region's riverbeds. Salt was not. It had to cross hundreds of miles of desert on camelback, exposed to raids and drought. The caravans themselves were financial systems in motion. Merchants assembled capital to purchase salt at northern mines like Tagaza. They hired guides, secured camels, negotiated protection with desert tribes. The journey could take months. On arrival, salt was traded for gold dust, cola nuts, or slaves, and the cycle reversed. Risk was distributed across investors and caravan leaders. Profit depended on maintaining routes and relationships. The relative value of salt and gold in these exchanges reflected immediate utility. Gold adorned rulers and facilitated tribute. Salt sustained populations and livestock. In climates where sweating was constant and diets monotonous, its absence was quickly felt. As European states centralized in the early modern period, the fiscal potential of salt became more explicit. Wars grew more expensive. Standing armies required regular pay. Artillery and fortifications demanded capital. Monarchies sought revenue streams that were reliable and difficult to evade. A land tax required assessing property and negotiating with local elites. Customs duties fluctuated with trade volumes. Salt, consumed by nearly everyone, offered a broader base. The gabelle in France became one of the crown's principal sources of income. Its complexity, different rates in different provinces, reflected layers of historical privilege and political compromise. Some regions were exempt. Others paid heavily. This unevenness had consequences. Smuggling networks expanded along internal borders where tax rates differed sharply. Entire communities participated. Enforcement required inspectors, courts, and prisons. Administrative capacity grew alongside resentment. In China, salt also played a central fiscal role. As early as the Tang dynasty, the state operated a salt monopoly to finance military campaigns. Officials issued salt certificates to licensed merchants, who then distributed the commodity across vast territories. The certificates themselves acquired value, circulating as quasi-financial instruments. The system allowed the imperial government to extract revenue without directly transporting every grain. The logic repeated across continents. Control supply, license distribution, monetize necessity. Salt's weight made it expensive to move, but this very heaviness protected margins where transport routes were scarce. Alpine passes, river crossings, and maritime straits became strategic points. The Via Salaria in ancient Rome, literally the salt road, carried the mineral from coastal marshes to the interior. Roman soldiers were at times compensated with allowances intended for purchasing salt, a practice that contributed to the word's salary. The detail was less about literal payment in crystals than about the commodity's integration into compensation and provisioning. Over time, improvements in transport and production reduced some of salt's scarcity. New mining techniques opened deeper deposits in Central Europe. Expanding maritime networks lowered shipping costs. As supply widened, relative prices shifted. Gold retained its monetary aura. Salt became cheaper in many regions. Yet the fiscal architecture built upon it endured. In France, resentment toward the gabelle simmered for centuries and became one of many grievances feeding into the Revolution of 1789. The tax was eventually abolished, briefly reinstated, and finally eliminated in the 19th century. By then, industrialization and diversified taxation had reduced the need for such direct monopolies. The deeper legacy was administrative. To tax salt effectively required measurement, record-keeping, enforcement, and standardized distribution. It required the state to map its territory and population. Warehouses had to be audited, licenses tracked, smugglers prosecuted. These practices strengthened bureaucracies. In Venice, revenue from salt helped finance a maritime empire that stretched from the Adriatic to the eastern Mediterranean. The arsenal could construct galleys at remarkable speed because funding was steady. Diplomacy with the Ottoman Empire and other powers rested partly on this fiscal base. The white crystals unloaded at Punta della Dogana translated, over time, into ships, walls, and treaties. Salt also reshaped trade geography. Regions rich in brine springs or coastal flats became economic nodes. Lüneburg in northern Germany prospered on salt mining, supplying the Hanseatic League's trade in preserved herring. The fish, cured with Lüneburg salt, fed urban populations from London to Novgorod. A chain connected mine, merchant, ship, and city table. Where salt was scarce, political authority often intervened more forcefully. Where it was abundant, private enterprise sometimes dominated. The balance between monopoly and market varied, but the commodity's importance rarely did. By the 19th century, chemical industries discovered new uses for salt in producing soda ash and chlorine. It became a feedstock for manufacturing, not merely a preservative. Railways and steamships further lowered transport costs. The price gap between regions narrowed. Salt no longer rivaled gold in exchange ratios. But the centuries when it did left marks on institutions. Modern excise taxes, levies on specific goods such as tobacco, alcohol, or fuel, follow a similar principle. They target commodities with broad consumption and relatively predictable demand. Administrative systems designed to monitor these flows owe something to earlier experiments with salt. The idea that a state could stabilize its finances by controlling and taxing a necessary input became embedded in fiscal practice. Gold continued to anchor monetary systems for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. It served as a reserve, a benchmark, a settlement asset between central banks. Salt never played that role. Its power was more immediate and more granular. It operated at the level of kitchens and barracks, fishing fleets and caravans. The comparison between salt and gold was never absolute. It shifted with geography and era. In desert markets where gold dust was plentiful and salt had crossed vast distances, scales sometimes balanced them equally. In European cities with access to mines and coasts, gold usually commanded higher prices per weight. Yet the phrase that salt was worth more than gold captured something real about human priorities. One metal symbolized stored wealth. The other preserved life. On a quiet afternoon in the 15th century, as the Venetian barge completed its unloading, the last barrel was rolled across the stone quay and into a warehouse marked with the Republic's insignia. The clerk sanded his ledger entry to dry the ink. Outside, the tide shifted gently against the pilings. Within those walls lay a substance so common to the table that it was easily overlooked, yet so essential to the state that it was counted with the care of treasure. The crystals waited in the dim light, indistinguishable from one another, while beyond the lagoon the machinery of empire moved, financed, in part, by salt. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.